I think it's important to note that there are many different types of qualitative interview. These range from very structured interviews all the way through to completely unstructured, in-depth interviews. Most commonly certainly in social science research, is the use of semi-structured interviews. And semi-structured interviews offer the best of both worlds. They allow some level of structure to the interview. For example, set questions that need to be answered, but also allow a level of flexibility so that a researcher can deviate from a list of questions in order to ascertain in-depth and illuminating data. Unstructured interviews rely very heavily on skilled researchers who are able to conduct an interview with very few prompts or guiding questions. Structured interviews, on the other hand, are, as the title would suggest, highly structured in nature, so that questions often have to be asked in very set ways, using set wording, and it's often very similar to a questionnaire that's administered verbally. That's how I like to think of a structured interview. But for most of you in your practice or in your dissertations or research going forward, the semi-structured interview does offer many advantages. So as I mentioned at the start, this is a very practical lecture, and I hope to give you some tips on how to do qualitative research. Now, these are based on mainly my own experiences, but there are lots of textbooks out there that will be able to support the material that I give you today. So, based on the fact that you've recruited somebody to interview, the first thing you need to consider is the first contact that you may have with that individual. And in my experience, the first contact you have with a potential interviewee is absolutely critical. That first contact will put your interviewee at ease and will often make the process of conducting the interview itself much easier. So think about how you would greet the individual. How will you introduce yourself? How will you behave? How will you dress? How will you look? And what is useful to think about is that they will more often be more nervous than you are. So whilst this may be the first time you've interviewed someone, the person that you're interviewing will often be thinking to themselves, what question will I be asked? Will I be able to answer it? Will I give the answer that they want? So try and put your interviewee at ease when you start the interview process. The next thing you may want to think about is the actual, what we call positionality. So where will you sit in relation to the interviewee? Again, you may think this is quite trivial, but actually there's growing and quite strong literature around how these non-verbal signals influence the data that's gathered. So you may want to consider which type of interview you would like to conduct. If you look at the diagram on the left, there is a desk in between the interviewee and the interviewer. Now that might be something that you want to have for practical reasons. You may want to write notes down, or you may want to have somewhere to put your recorder. But often having a desk in the way of somebody is a physical barrier to building rapport and gaining trust. So the diagram on the right is another way of positioning yourself in relation to the interviewee. Having a desk there is often useful, like I said, for putting tape recorders down or for taking notes. But using it in the way on the right is often a much more open and much more likely to build rapport with an individual than the option on the left, which will probably remind someone of a job interview. So you may want to think very carefully about how you position yourself in relation to your interviewee. Okay, the next stage of the interview that you may want to consider is about the initial introduction. So you've presented yourself, you've sat the interviewee down. Now is your opportunity to reiterate the purpose of why you've asked that person to be interviewed. And that will be talking through the ethics of the research, so ensuring perhaps things like confidentiality and anonymity, the person's right to withdraw, perhaps talking about the recording of the interview and whether people are happy to consent to that. So that initial process is really important to reiterate why that individual is there and what he or she will offer and what you can offer them in terms of ethical safeguards. Once that's all been established, then you can begin the interview. Now, often the first question that you might ask is gathering in contextual information mainly. So it could be about describing someone's role or describing the work that people may have done. So often that beginning question is very non-threatening, very easy for someone to respond to. And that's very important because it allows the person to feel comfortable in that particular situation. So if everything goes well with the interview, you will then move into, I guess, what I've called the main body of the interview, which is about asking your key questions to answer your research aims and objectives. So this is where you're really getting to grips with really answering the areas that you wish to cover in the interview itself. Now, you want to think carefully about how long the interview will last. If you're doing in-depth or unstructured interviews, you may have to allow for perhaps a couple of hours for an interview. If you're interviewing busy, say, health professionals, say a GP or a nurse, or say people who work in policy or local government, you may have to think more pragmatically about how long you will realistically have with those individuals. So you may only have 15 or 20 minutes in which to cover the main areas of investigation. Once you've completed your interview, you need to think carefully about how you're going to end the interview or wrap it up. And make sure that the participant has said everything they would like to say. And of course, after the interview, it's common sense, but you thank your participant for his or her time. And also think about how they will receive the findings from your research, or whether that is appropriate. How will you get in touch with them and show them how their contribution has added to the research? So we've talked about the interview process itself, from first contact right the way through to ending the interview. And I want to take a couple of steps back and think about the actual questions that you want to ask. And that's often called the interview schedule. So the interview schedule is outlining the areas that you wish to investigate or explore during the interview process. So the interview schedule is your way of ensuring that you cover your research aims and your research objectives. Think of it as an aide-memoire. So if your mind goes blank during an interview, you have your interview schedule in front of you so that you can remember exactly what lines of questioning you wish to pursue during the interview. An interview schedule is really important because it allows consistent data collection across a sample or across a number of interviews. However, this does not mean that you can't be flexible. It just ensures that you broadly ask the same question to all of your participants. An interview schedule is particularly important when you're researching in a big research team, whereby there may be 4 or 5 different individuals conducting interviews. So it ensures that, again, the interviews that are being conducted are broadly similar in terms of the line of investigation and inquiry. An interview schedule is also very helpful because it's a document that publicly shows the types of questions you've asked during the interview. So often students will place their interview schedule in their appendix to show the actual specific questions they asked during the interview process. So the design of an interview schedule is very, very important. A poor interview schedule will often result in poor data. And if you have poor data, you will inevitably produce poor research. Okay, so some tips for designing schedules. Again, this has come mainly from my own experience. Really important one is to know the literature. Where there are gaps in the literature, this is where your interview schedule will allow you to explore and investigate those research gaps. So, knowing the evidence base for the area that you're investigating is really important, and that will help you think about the types of questions that need to be asked during the interview. Speak to your supervisors. If this is part of a dissertation, for example, then speak to your supervisors about the interview schedule. They will often have lots of experience about what effective interview schedules look like and how to design them. So do talk to your supervisor during this process. Again, fairly common sense, but the idea of an interview schedule in qualitative research is to allow people to talk in depth and openly about a certain situation. So try and avoid closed questions. Now, closed questions are those questions that often result in a yes or no answer. So there's an example here. I love going to the cinema with my partner. Do you? You can answer yes or you can answer no. So try to avoid those closed forms of questioning. Again, common sense, but ask clear questions. Don't be ambiguous. And I always use this test whenever I'm putting together an interview schedule. And that is to think of yourself as the person being interviewed. And after each question, ask yourself, would you like to be asked that question? If the answer is no, then my advice is to remove the question or reframe the question. Interview schedules, you may also want to think about the actual layout of the interview schedule, what it looks like, what works for you. Do you like colour? Do you like italics? Do you want to distinguish between main questions and sub-questions? So you need to think personally about how the interview schedule will look, because this will be your tool for gathering the information. So it has to work for you. Think about whether you want the interview schedule on one page, several pages. Some people feel very confident or more confident with lots and lots of information in front of them. Others don't. So again, think about what would suit you. Again, as already mentioned, think about the time you'll have. If you know that you will only have 15 or 20 minutes with an individual, don't prepare an interview schedule that will last for 2.5 hours, because it's not going to work. You're not going to be able to cover all the issues you wish to cover. Think about the language that you use. Only use jargon or acronyms where you know the person will fully understand those terminology. Also think about what your opening question will be and what your closing question will be. I think these are really important points in the interview. So we've talked about that over the last few slides about the actual process itself. So think about what type of question you'll start with, and again how you'll end the interview. It's also a good idea to test your interview schedule or pilot the interview schedule so that the questions work. You don't want to go into a situation whereby the questions are unclear or they don't fit together well. So try, if you can, to pilot your interview schedule before using it for real. As well as thinking about the questions that you want to ask, the concept of probing within an interview is also very valuable. So probing is a way of gaining further information from respondents beyond the interview schedule that you set out. Good probing will allow you to really get detailed exploration and understanding of an area. Most probes are spontaneous. You can't think about them in advance. They're often based upon what an interviewee will say. So it's very difficult to set out what you will probe in advance of the interview. So probes really are things like trying to ascertain more information. So a really good probe is to be silent, because often in an interview, the person who is doing the interviewing will want to ask the next question and want to move on because they're trying to get through the material. And actually what they're not doing is listening. And I think by being silent, only for a millisecond within an interview, you allow the respondent to perhaps elaborate on an idea or elaborate on something that they've said. So trying not to rush into asking the next question is really important. So there's other examples here. A very useful example is where you get people to give an example. So can you give me an example of when that last happened? Or can you tell me more about that? These are all probes that allow you to gain more in-depth information beyond the question that you ask. So try and think about how you probe within an interview to gather the most data you possibly can from the interview itself. One of the really important aspects of qualitative interviewing is to build a research relationship with the person that you're interviewing. Think about how you would go about building rapport and establishing trust with a research participant. Without considering how you would do this, your data will not be as rich and as full. So just some final summing up and practicalities really. Be prepared for every single possible situation that may arise during the interview process, and be prepared to tackle any interviewee concerns that he or she may have. Think about where you do the interview. Think about privacy. Think about the comfort of the setting. Give some thought to this, as your data will be different depending on the location that you choose. Think about when the interview will be conducted and how long that will last. Think about whether an incentive or providing a monetary or a voucher for people to conduct an interview is important. You'll need to think about the budget for this, the ethics of doing so, the sample size, and again, the practical logistics of doing that. Think about your own safety and the participant's safety whilst conducting an interview. And again, on the most practical level, think about refreshments. Just showing someone that you've thought about refreshments can give a kind of element of respect and will help build that trust from forming.